there's just a little comment here from Yolanda. Hi, Yolanda, saying that it's really quiet.
Oh.
I don't know if that's her technology or ours.
Yeah, I think, can anyone else just indicate if it is a little bit too quiet for them? Yolanda, you might just have to turn, okay, so Yolanda, maybe just turn your volume up or maybe your headphones. I'm not sure. Okay, thank you so much for that, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Yeah,
okay, we'll start.
Shall we get started, Phil?
Cara, would you like to start by introducing yourself?
Yeah, sure. So my name is Cara Shipp. I am a Wiradjuri lady from Dubbo, and on my father's side, and Welsh on my mother's side. And I've worked in Canberra leading Aboriginal programs for about a decade, and recently just moved to the Gold Coast to work at Silkwood School. So I'm now part of the Big Picture Education Australia network, where we design the learning around students' interests, and we have a focus on project-based learning. So I'm up here at the Gold Coast, sitting on Yugamba land, and I want to acknowledge the Komimeri people of the Yugambeh Nation, who have looked after this beautiful
Hi there,
area.
it's Holly Peters calling. I missed a call from you guys earlier this morning, so just ringing you back.
We've got a bit of Holly needs to mute herself.
Yeah, it's in tomorrow.
Is there a Holly there who can mute themselves?
So what was the surname on that one again?
Peters, P-E-T-E-R-S.
Holly, there we go.
Yeah.
All right.
I'll just mute Holly there. Okay, so so I just acknowledge the traditional custodians of this beautiful area here on the Gold Coast. Over to you, Phil.
Thanks, Cara. I'm the AATE Treasurer and I'm a retired English teacher. I've been managing the Reading Australia, or the secondary part of the Reading Australia program for AATE since it began in 2013. I'm coming to you today from Lutruwita, which is Tasmania, and I'm on the lands of the Merrimana and Palawa peoples, who were dispossessed by my ancestors in the 1820s, others as well, I have to add. So that's me. Our bios and contact details are available on the end of this PowerPoint, which will be available to you. So today's session focuses specifically on some of the indigenously written and non-traditional Reading Australia texts, their diversity, some of the issues they confront, many of which are challenging and contentious, and how these texts can be taught in an inclusive, respectful and culturally informed way. Some of you might be aware that Reading Australia began as a Copyright Agency Cultural Fund initiative to provide a platform for the promotion of Australian literature within the Australian community and its teaching in schools and other educational institutions. Originally an initiative of the Australian Society of Authors, it began by forefronting what it then considered to be the most iconic and culturally significant texts across all genres and mediums within Australian literature, a very tall and I think, a deliberately contentious order. Initially, the list had a distinctly white European and colonial background flavour, although some of its featured works, I'll just move on, some of its featured works, so there's some of the early texts, as you can see, the traditional ones that we associate with Australian literature. But at the same time, it also began to include other voices, not just traditional white European or colonial texts. So you have a couple of Indigenous written texts there, famous Jack Davis's No Sugar, Tara June Winch, whose latest text, The Yield, I have still to read, but I've heard wonderful resources about. Chloe Hooper's explosive journalistic piece, The Tall Man, on the Palm Island incident, and of course Nam Lee's The Boat, which is a collection of link short stories on refugees. From that point, and in response to teacher demand, the catalogue has been expanded, and it includes much more contemporary and more culturally diverse material across all styles and genres. So you can see the essay of Tim Flannery, Drum from the 7 Stages of Grieving, the Indigenous Story of Ruby, that teaching resource was written by Cara, and of course things such as The Slap, which have been such explosive texts within Australia. From that point, we've specifically moved into indigenously authored and edited texts. One of our challenges has been to try and get a spread of texts across all year levels. There are plenty of texts we've found which are certainly suitable for 11 and 12 and beyond, but it's been fairly difficult to actually source texts that are, if you like, junior secondary or from year 7 onwards. And so you see Ubby's Underdogs there, there's a trilogy there, Becoming Kirrilly Lewis, probably year 10, That Dead Man Dance, you know, certainly year 12, Legendary Tales of the Australian Aborigines. I've included that because it's an egregious example of cultural theft by
You've muted yourself.
Sorry, what happened there? Okay, so these texts cover a range of year groups, styles, and right through to Ubby's Underdogs, which is one of my favourites, which are the most marvellous graphic novels. There's a trilogy of them put out by Magabala Books. And over the last 3 or 4 years, there's been a deliberate move to reflect the diversity of Australia, to the voice of the unheard, the ignored, the forgotten, the marginalised, the non-privileged and the culturally excluded. So you can see a couple of those texts, Purple Threads, for example, is in production at the moment, as is Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia. Dark Emu is there because it's certainly a very contentious text at the moment, and it's contested, certainly contested by some of the right-wing, I was going to say fascist media. I won't mention any names, but they're certainly contested texts, but we believe they have a very substantial place in the Australian literary canon and are fantastic examples of Indigenous scholarship. Similarly with Jandamara and the Bunuba Resistance, that actually is a text which has been co-written by the traditional owners of the story, represented by Banja Wurrunmurra and by the historian Howard Peterson. And of course, I think that's a great collaboration to work, to have a non-Indigenous writer work with an Indigenous expert and elder, and that's one of the trends we're seeing more and more.
Phil, before you move on, can I just comment on those texts there? You mentioned before the challenge of getting texts together that are appropriate for the younger years, and particularly when we're working in this space dealing with Indigenously authored texts. Obviously, the subject matter of a lot of the texts is going to be challenging, and most Indigenous authors have personal experience with stolen generations and transgenerational trauma, etc., and that plays through their texts, which are great to study but can be difficult in the classroom with younger kids. So these four here, well, actually not Dark Emu, but the young version, young Dark Emu, also published by Magabala Books. These four, I would say, would sit quite nicely in the year 7 and 8
Yep.
part of the curriculum. Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia is great because it's a collection of short stories, and so you can dip in and out of them. And Purple Threads is a really beautifully written, warm kind of story of you know, strong women bringing up generations within their family. So they're possibly more positive types of texts, and they're also more palatable, I guess, for the younger age group.
Indeed, Cara, and many of the stories are not just stories of oppression, but they're stories of resilience and strength and courage and determination, and also celebrations, as are some of these. Some of these are quite contemporary. Grace Beside Me, Jared Thomas has sung songs that sound like blood, Us Mob Walla Warru. And Kath Walker in China, that's the way it's presented. It's out of print now. It's obviously written by Ujuru, Nunakal. We've included it because it was, its poems are included on the New South Wales Senior Literature or Literature Text List. That's not the only reason it was included, obviously, but that's one of the reasons that we use to select texts. As well as Indigenous texts, the catalogue now includes much more diverse material from that multiplicity of Australian voices that make us today. Oma Musa, Here Come the Dogs, is one of the most confronting texts I've read in a long time, written from the perspective of a South Pacific island, a Macedonian, and a Leb, as he's called. Alice Pung's Unpolished Gem, which is absolutely delightful. Maxine Benedict-Clark's The Hate Race, and of course, the very, very challenging Natural Way of Things by Charlotte Wood. There are The Hate Race. I've got the teaching resource for that one sitting in front of me at the moment. It's next week's job to do the final editing on that. One of the things Reading Australia also does is it works with the Garrett, which is a Melbourne-based outfit run by Astrid Edwards, and it's a series of interviews of writers who are talking about writing. We've done something like 36 interview and teaching resources, 8 of which are with Indigenous writers. Here are just some of them: Alexis Wright, Charlotte Wood, Maxine, and Melissa. And there are some very exciting new ones on the way. Black is the New White. I have that in front of me as well, ready to go out for review. All of these texts, by the way, are reviewed by Indigenous reviewers, even if they're written by non-Indigenous people. They're all, in fact, Cara's most recent work, Too Much Lip, was reviewed Indigenously as well. A very valuable experience. And Gawayu for All Times, the latest collection of First Languages Nations poetry written in First Nations languages, which is due to be published next month. It's a bit of a first for Reading Australia to actually put out support a resource before it's actually been published. Meet Me at the Intersection, which reflects the interculturality of Australia today. And of course, that wonderful Finding Eliza by Larissa Berent, which I'm really looking forward to reading. That's not due out till next year, but it's on the way. Okay, as mentioned earlier, some of these texts are very confronting, and they deal with topics that many would rather not acknowledge. They're the subject of prejudice, or whose content is direct and explicit in terms of sexuality, violence, language, interpersonal relationships, and so on. And here are just some of them. Too Much Lip, as Cara has written the teaching resource for that. The Drover's Wife has been written by Nirvana Watkins, a Victorian teacher. Ruby Moonlight has been written by Prue Gill from the ACT, and Ellen Van Nieven's Heat and Light has also been written by Cara. So what this does, it reflects, what literature does is it reflects an Australian identity, depictions of Australian identity as changing and as emerging, offering an insight to what it looks like at any particular point in time. It can be and is fluid and contested. It's multifaceted and diverse. It's also sometimes silencing and marginalising by just sheer weight of text crowding out others. It's often a denial of Indigenous and non-Anglo identities and the privileged place of the settler myth, but it can also be a pushing back against the traditional white cultural norm of colonialism, both in the past and the present. One of the things that I continue to learn by being part of this program is that many Indigenous people regard Australia still as a colonial country. And I have to agree. Sorry, just on a bit. Okay. And this quote by one of the acknowledged experts in this field, Anita Heiss, which I'll read out in full. I can't see it all there, I'm afraid. Okay. Our writing records our truths about history up until the present day. Our books function as tools for reconciliation, allowing non-Indigenous Australians to engage with us in a non-challenging and non-confrontational way. Our writing provides a means of self-representation in Australian and world literature and assists readers to understand the diversity of our identities in the 21st century. Much of our writing challenges subjective and often negative media stereotypes and representations of our lives as Australians and as human beings. In this way, our literature has become an important resource in assisting teachers to embed Indigenous perspectives into the educational curricula around the country. And for those of you who are not, and I can't believe that anyone would not be familiar with Anita Heiss, but she edited the Macquarie Pen Anthology of Aboriginal Literature. She has also edited one of our new texts, Growing Up Aboriginal in Australia, one of a series of texts. And she is also involved with AusLit and the Black Words database based in Brisbane. And she is our acknowledged expert. Okay, over to you, Cara.
Oh, thank you. I'll just kick you off and share my screen quickly. Now that's going to ask me to refresh. Sorry about the messy screen here. Okay, so yes, as we've said earlier, it's a big topic, so we won't get through all of this in this session, but you'll have the PowerPoint available afterwards as a resource to come back to. I guess I've written a lot about this and spoken a lot about this topic at previous conferences, and I've got most of my previous presentations as well as blog articles and things like that are available on my blog, which will point you to a little bit later. There's two parts, obviously, to the cultural sensitivity question. One is around your treatment of the actual text itself and understanding what might be the nuances of that particular text and what are the particular aspects of culture or aspects of an Indigenous experience of colonialism, etc., that you need to be across and understand and treat sensitively in your dealing of the text. And so the Reading Australia resources that I have written, and I know that other resource writers have done the same, I've included quite extensive preparation notes at the start of each unit to help teachers unpack some of the key themes that come about in Indigenously authored texts. So understanding what we mean when we talk about intergenerational trauma and stolen generations and links to or references to mission days. So those sorts of references that might be sprinkled through a text by an Indigenous author, I've kind of unpacked and given a little bit of an understanding for teachers of how to set students up to understand those references and understand that history and the Aboriginal perspective of history that might be permeating through the text. Obviously, texts that are contentious and containing, you know, either community or family violence, abuse, drug use, crime, etc. You know, they're always going to be difficult to bring into the classroom. You need to put a fair bit of consideration into how you bring those in and support your students to understand them, but they're often so worth studying for a range of, you know, literary merits or the thematic discussions that come about from reading them. I think that you need to really consider your school community context carefully before choosing to introduce some of those more contentious texts. I think you need to make sure that you and your teachers who are teaching the texts are prepared to introduce students safely to the themes, and you need to think about whether your school has the capacity to spend a really good amount of class time exploring the broader issues and really doing a lot more front loading, I think, to some of these texts to explain some of the references, cultural and historical references that the authors might be making, that you need to help your students unpack in order to really understand the text. Because, for example, if you have a text that depicts, you know, a family that is not particularly, you know, that is quite dysfunctional, where there might be some abuse or history of alcoholism, etc., without going through some front loading around intergenerational trauma and stolen generations and how that's impacted on people and how that might play out in an Aboriginal family through substance abuse and cycles of abuse. Without kind of doing that, then you're leaving the students open to just interpreting it as a depiction of Aboriginal families in quite a two-dimensional way, and thinking, oh, well, this is Aboriginal people just have these dysfunctional families and with alcoholism and abuse. So if you don't have the time to really delve into those broader discussions and research and historical context, then I would suggest, you know, it's not really worth doing for the purpose of broadening students' understanding of Aboriginal perspectives and cultures. I think that you, let me just move that on. I think that there are ways around that. So if you're thinking this is a big contentious text and I'm not sure how this is going to work in my school community, maybe think about piloting it with a small group of teachers and maybe an extension class and some community members and some parents as well. And rather than not touch the topic at all, seek advice on some other texts with similar themes or aims that, you know, you might be able to bring in that are more suitable for your particular community or for the time frame that you have with which to work. I think that it's also really important to ensure that the students, as I've said, are really clear in their understanding that a text, you know, as with any text you study in English, it may deal, sorry, there's a typo there, with some realities. It may be working on generalisations and stereotypes that have some truth in them, but they're never necessarily the absolute realities of every single person within that cultural group. So just to really contextualise your discussions when you are picking apart themes in a text or things, you know, events that happen in a text, and make sure that the students are not just making a generalisation that, oh, this particular event or theme is indicative of all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and families, etc. And also just reiterating that, you know, you're reading fiction and fiction authors take realities and truths and they expose them through their own choice of lenses, using literary devices to generalise and embellish and highlight and question. So, you know, the text can bring out really rich discussions about real issues in our community, or real aspects of history that we need to confront and talk about, but they are fictional texts, and you need to make sure that the students are remaining conscious of that as well in reading. I do also kind of recommend steering away from romanticising indigeneity, I guess, or, you know, talking about any cultures really, not just Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, but cultures represented in a text in terms of a valorous past that, you know, when they were in their pure cultural form, they were so wonderful, and now look what's happened. Or placing Indigenous people into a position of victimhood, perpetuating beliefs that cultures and languages are gone and in the past, and Aboriginal people were this and did that, because we're still here, we're still practicing culture in various ways. We've adapted cultures, and we're now practicing new forms of cultures, and you will undoubtedly have Aboriginal kids in your classrooms wondering why you're talking about Aboriginal people as in the past tense. So just being really conscious of that as well.
Cara, can I just jump in for a moment? That is particularly true from Tasmania, where there is still a very strong belief that there are no Indigenous people, original Indigenous people in Tasmania. I think the battle is slowly being won, but it's a hard fight. Yeah,
definitely. And just, you know, making space for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the classroom and school community. So seeking the opinions of the local community, usually best done by your Aboriginal liaison officer if you have one in your school, but you can go down and speak to your local Aboriginal Land Council, or, you know, there's normally some kind of Aboriginal run organisation in the city area of your or CBD area of where you live that you can go to and seek some connection with them to get their opinions about what you're teaching, and make space for the kids in your classroom who may have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander heritage. This needs to be done, of course, in subtle ways. Nobody wants to be the spokesperson for their whole, you know, for all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And, you know, like any kid, a lot of kids don't like to be put on the spot and asked to speak out in front of the class. So I would be checking in with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students in my classroom to get their opinions, not just of these particular texts, if you're doing an Indigenous text, but of anything in your content. What's their perspective on what it is that you're discussing in class? Seek that out privately. Keep your door open. Let them know your door's open for their feedback and input. And they might not take it up, but just knowing that you've made that statement to them and opened your door is really important. Monitor the themes of your classroom conversations so that, you know, try to think about how might this current classroom conversation be sounding to the Aboriginal student who's sitting in my classroom. How might that they be hearing and interpreting these conversations that we're having in the classroom. Then there's cultural competence in general. So I've talked a bit about, you know, thinking specifically about the texts and dealing with them in culturally sensitive ways. But just in general, schools are not great at this, and the better that they get at it, the easier everything else will be. So trying to do some Indigenous text justice in your English classroom will come much more easily if your whole school is actually trying to have some relationships, some authentic relationships with the local Aboriginal people. So I can't stress that enough. It takes time, it's slow and steady, because schools and governments are not trusted places, obviously, for Aboriginal community members. So, you know, nobody's going to just start coming to the school and being guest speakers and handing over their stories to you until they know that you're fair dinkum, that you actually want to have a really rich relationship where you seek their guidance and their input into what you do, and you're willing to listen and listen more than talk, which is something that white people and teachers find really difficult, actually. So I think listening more than talking is probably the biggest piece of advice that most Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will give on the topic of cultural competence. Things don't always move quickly or in a linear way until you develop a relationship with the local people. So when I hear teachers, you know, when I've heard in the past the teachers say, oh, you know, I tried to engage and no one would ring me back, then that's done and, you know, it stops there. That, to me, that's disappointing, because that's not really, I guess, taking on board the fact that, no, you're going to have to actually work a little bit harder than that and keep showing your interest over time and building some trust before you get a reciprocal relationship happening. I'll skip through this quite quickly, but just some things that you need to let go of, and schools in particular. I found that this myself, even, you know, as an Aboriginal person, but in a school environment, you've got deadlines, everything's in 10-week terms. And so if you don't get someone's answer really quickly, well, that unit's finished and done and I'm on to the next thing. So unfortunately, the way that our Western schools work really is in direct opposition to the way Aboriginal communities work, where you sit down and you yarn and things take time. But what you do get in the end is something much richer. So you need to start thinking about what you can let go of in terms of productivity and outcomes and things happening in a very linear way by this date, etc. And let go of some of that in order to build and develop that relationship with your community. And once you've put that initial time in, things will happen quickly after that. You know, I know that I'm still building my connections up here now in the Gold Coast, but in Canberra, I have been there for a long time. Sorry. And I knew a lot of the community, and it still took me ages as a teacher to build my relationship with everyone in the education context of building trust with people to come into the school. But in the end, once I had trust and knew people, then I could call people up quite quickly and say, hey, you know, I've got this teacher teaching this topic next week or next month. Do you know, would you like to come in and talk about it, etc. And oh yeah, we'll come around on Tuesday. So things can happen quite quickly once you've got that relationship going. So there's a comment from audience member asking about keeping on going back to people who don't respond feels like hounding them. What's the best thing to do? I think it's probably, I think a lot of Indigenous community members appreciate if you keep trying, not necessarily hounding and ringing and all the time, but every few months if you're checking in, or if you're even better if you're able to pop up at events where those people are going to be, community events involving Aboriginal people and organisations in your city or community. So not necessarily emailing and ringing all the time, but just sort of being visible and connecting and being in a position to say hi. to the same people, and reminding them, oh yeah, I work at this school, really keen to get some partnerships happening. I think a lot of Aboriginal community members are happy to have this. They don't necessarily see it as hounding. If they're unhappy with you and think you're hounding them, they'll tell you. And then you know not to bother anymore. But that a lot of people, they wait until you do ask a couple of times before they know that you're fair dinkum. So that's probably, I don't know if it's something that's in every Aboriginal community. It's certainly been my experience across New South Wales and ACT. And so it might be a difference in a sort of a cultural difference in approach.
Cara, can I just add too that schools have in my experience anyway, schools have a tendency to say, well, we'll invite in a guest speaker, you know, but we won't pay them. And I think that's, you know, people don't give their time for nothing. So I think we ought to recognise that if you're asking for someone's time, you need to be in a position where you're going to pay for it.
Yeah, definitely. And that can be prohibitive, of course, I understand that. But there's often a lot of grants available for that sort of thing. So if you can initially start to get some grants to pay some local people to come in and speak and do and run some sessions and things like that, eventually, again, as you've got that relationship with each other, they'll start to want to come in and in more of a voluntary capacity if they feel like they're respected and the work they're doing is having an impact on your school community in a positive way. So, yeah, start by wanting to pay your guests appropriately, but you will find more and more as you develop those relationships, they'll be usually keen to work with you, not necessarily always in a paid capacity. I'll skip through these next couple of slides, but these are just some key resources for professional learning, for your own professional learning. So Auntie Kay Price is in Canberra, an academic in Canberra from Tasmania, Tasmanian Aboriginal people originally. And so this is a really great history of education for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students and how that impacts your students today. And it has some great discussions on really contesting the constructedness of identities and the baggage you might be taking into the classroom with your identity set, and also, you know, whose curriculum are we actually teaching here. Welcome to Country is a newer resource, but another great resource for non-Indigenous people's own building of cultural competence and professional understanding. And there's also a student version of this available with teachers' notes as well. The Yarning Strong series was quite popular a while back, and little readers written by Indigenous authors, and they were quite nice, simple and nicely illustrated texts that worked well for primary school and middle years, sort of year 7 and 8. So they had the readers and then they had the professional support manual that goes with it. And Stronger Smarter is a fantastic leadership program for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people and schools working within the space of Aboriginal and Islander education. So they've got an online learning module as well to build your own cultural awareness and competence. These are some key articles from my blog. So I might just dip out of there and actually show you. Oops, where am I? Sorry, I've got a million things open up here. So this is my blog here, Miss Shipp. .wordpress.com, and There are some key PowerPoint presentations from earlier conferences. The one in Hobart in particular has a whole lot of suggested book titles that would be really useful for you to have a look at.
Cara, I can't see it.
Sorry?
I
Oh,
can't see it.
am I not sharing? Hang on, let me just switch.
The button should just be at the bottom.
Yeah.
You got it. There it is.
Yeah, sorry, I forgot to do that. This book, so the 2017 Hobart Conference has a PowerPoint with some book suggestions, but this page here, book lists and reviews, just has links to all of the different articles I've written over the years or talked about at conferences that just literally list books and suggested titles for your book lists in schools, and a couple of reviews as well. So that's a useful resource, and I'll just quickly show you. Hopefully that will, if I switch. Can you see the teaching with black words?
No.
No? Okay, I've got to switch that again. Sorry, guys. This is the Black Words database on AustLit, and so this is a database of texts that Anita Heiss and Queensland Uni have put together. And what's great about this is that there's also some actual teacher professional development resources. There's a really fantastic historical timeline of all the key events that have happened in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander history post-colonisation. So things that are really important to us that have happened, such as the Wave Hill walk-off and different land rights campaigns, Gough Whitlam handing land back to the Wave Hill people. Those sorts of things that aren't often taught in standard history curriculum, but are often actually alluded to in a lot of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander texts, and so useful for teachers to sort of see, you know, what does Australian history look like from an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspective. Okay, let me just go back to the...
While Cara's doing that, I hope everyone's aware that most school libraries in Australia have access. It's a subscriber resource. Just about every school library in Australia subscribes to that resource, as do universities. You can also access the AusLit database through your own state library service, although it's sometimes clunky, but it is accessible through all of those sources.
Yeah. I might get you, Phil, to go back to the PowerPoint, sharing the PowerPoint on your screen. Oh no,
Yep.
Here it is.
You got it? Yep.
I think I've got it. Can you see it?
Yep. Yep.
Okay, how are we going? We've got 10 minutes. These are the key publishers at the moment in publishing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander authors. Ngagabala Books is amazing. They're Australia's #1 publisher for Indigenous authors, and they have a whole range of teacher resources on their website as well. So I think every book they publish has a teacher resource to go with it, which is and they're quite extensive as well. Finally, just a few points in terms of how do I know if a resource I'm selecting is authentic, particularly when you're researching and trying to find historical information to front load or supplement a text that you're studying. You can't really divorce history from English when you're studying Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander texts. So, you know, the nice, neat faculties that high schools have, or English faculties and HASS faculties, doesn't necessarily work. You often have to do a little bit of delving into history to understand and appreciate a text. Always, as we do with critical literacy, thinking about who wrote the text and whose perspectives is it representing. But also when you're looking at service providers or information texts that you're seeking to supplement your teaching of a unit, you know, is the resource actually written by someone in a First Nations community? Who are they connected to? What are the local elders' relationships with these providers? And who else are they connected with in your local community? Are they open to working with the others in your local Aboriginal community, or are they demanding sole partnership with your school? Usually if these questions are answered pretty easily, or they're self-evident when the person starts talking to you about what they do, then you're probably working in an authentic space. So I know it can be fraught. People talk to me all the time about politics and what if I invite the wrong person into my school, or the wrong service provider that, you know, Auntie so-and-so doesn't like, and I get in trouble and that sort of thing. But, you know, obviously, once you've developed those relationships with the local elders in particular, run things by them all the time. Have you heard of this person? Have you heard of this service provider? Would you be happy for me to bring this person into our school? And if that service provider talks about their relationships with the local people and the elders, then you can be fairly confident that they are authentic, you know, you're working authentically and that they are connected with the community. Queensland Curriculum Authority has some great resources. They've got a checklist for how to select and evaluate a resource in terms of its authenticity in this Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander space. And they've also got some really nice explanations of different aspects of Aboriginal cultures, as well as some protocols around working with guest speakers, ethical research, building relationships, etc. So that's a really fantastic resource there to help you with navigating the politics. So back over to you, Phil. Sorry that I've taken up a fair bit of time.
Yeah.
Would you like to kick me off and share?
Okay, I'll just, how do I get rid of you?
If you just start
Share
sharing.
screen, here we go. Yep. Where are we? Yeah, okay, and share. Okay, we'll go back to the full. Okay, Cara has really gone through the reasons why we ought to be teaching culturally sensitive and more challenging issues. The voices are part of our country. We need to hear those voices rather than exclude them. And it's not just about a matter of just ticking a box and say we embed this literature within our curriculum. It's about building empathy and understanding, acceptance and inclusion. It's about illuminating past injustices and present day discriminatory practice. But it's also about celebration of achievement and acknowledgement of that great wealth of Indigenous creative talent which springs from culture and country. In doing this though, we need to approach text sometimes with a very much a scaffolded approach. Cara's talked about taking your time. You just can't say, well, next week we're going to do this. It doesn't work that way. So you have to build knowledge and respect for your Indigenous cultures and an acceptance of their differences and diversity, and work with that, not try and force yourself upon it. You need to highlight, you know, the injustices of the past, the impacts of invasion, marginalisation, and continuing colonisation, and recognise and appreciate the reassertion of cultural identity, which is so strong today, and rightly so. Many of these texts, though, are pretty confronting, and getting in and getting out of them with your sanity intact and your emotional stability intact is sometimes difficult. And I don't think we can just drop students in the middle of some of these texts. Cara's already spoken about, you know, what they might mean for Indigenous families, but also for non-Indigenous families. Some of these issues are extraordinarily confronting. If you have a look at the Indigenous massacres map, which we've listed at the end as one of the resources, it's just horrifying, the history that we have to face and confront. So we've got to get kids in safely. We need to create, and I have to acknowledge the work here of people like Emma Jenkins, Alex Wharton, Nirvana Watkins, who have developed these techniques for dealing with Indigenous texts and Indigenous material, full stop. Culturally, emotionally and physically safe, sensitive and aware of students' comfort, discomfort or unease, opportunities for diversion or time out, and then celebrate acts of resistance or empathy, generosity, reciprocity, and intercultural understanding. And then safely out. And I'm put in here as a result of listening to the launch of Beyond the Dark this morning, include yourself in this, because sometimes you've got to get out yourself, and because some of these issues will stay with you, and particularly in sort of trying times when we're sort of tucked up alone so often, it's important to work through them. Debrief with your students, allow time for discussion, private journaling, exit cards, visible thinking activities, respond to questions thoughtfully and accurately, model an appropriate emotional response, address problematic attitudes with curiosity rather than criticism, avoid asking students to put themselves in the shoes of someone who does not share their lived experience, and provide opportunities for action. And I mentioned Beyond the Dark, shameless plug to AATE, but it does have a section in there mentioning Amble and Quaymullen as the Tribe series. And of course, for many Indigenous people today, Australia is still regarded as a dystopia. And which brings us to some further resources that Cara's put together.
And we won't have time. I think we've got to.
I'm so sorry.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Cara and Phil. All of us here really appreciate it. That was an amazing presentation. And I'm so sorry I have to cut you off. I could sit here and listen to this all day. So thank you so much.
No problems. Thanks, everybody.
Okay, see you guys. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, Phil. See ya.